We are going to begin our time together this afternoon by taking the first step of creating a community again. We've been together 3 times, but we're different every time we're here, right? And so I want to return some of you to a process you've done with me before, and others it will be the first time. But we're going to engage in 2 minutes of holy listening. So I'm going to ask you to find a partner, someone you didn't come with, and I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to give you about a minute to conjure up the answer that is resounding in your soul today, and then your partner and you are going to decide who goes first and who goes second. Okay? Go ahead and decide who your partners are. Okay, so holy listening. Holy listening. I'm going to ask the question. The question I'm going to ask, just to give you a little head start, is what is your wildest dream for the future of the church? What is your wildest dream for the future of the church? And you can take that wherever it goes, okay? Each of you is going to have 2 minutes to answer that question for your partner. While you are the listener, everybody knows who's going first? Who's the listener first? Because I'm talking to you. While you are listening, I want you to set aside everything else in the world. While you are listening, your only job is to receive what is coming to you. You don't have to speak back. You don't have to ask questions that show you're interested and that you're connecting. You don't have to think about what's for dinner. You don't have to think about what you just left behind. All you're doing is maintaining an openness to the possibility that the person in front of you is an incarnation of the holy for this little moment in time. That's the listener role. While you are speaking, your job is not to worry about how awesome your story is, whether it has a beginning, a middle, or an end. You don't have to worry about the packaging. You don't have to worry about how it's coming across. Just speak as much as you are able from your heart center. So we'll take a few deep breaths to center ourselves before we enter in, okay? And that's it. Everybody understand? It only lasts 2 minutes. Nobody dies in the process. I promise. I haven't lost one yet. All right, so we're going to just take a few deep breaths now, and we'll have a moment just to center our imaginations on the question, what is your wildest dream for the future of the church? When I say begin, the person who talks first, of course, will begin, but you have a minute or two to just sit there and breathe deep. Now let's just have a moment to thank, a little show of gratitude, and then we'll trade places. Thank you for coming out to play with me and with your partner. Take another deep breath now and exchange a show of gratitude. And give yourself just a few seconds to settle for what just happened to settle for you, what you just heard, how that felt, what it was like for you. Just note it in your body, in your mind, in your spirit. What was that like for you? We'll have some time in about 20 minutes to debrief that. But where I want to take you now is on a little bit of a different journey. I want to invite you to think with me about the future of the church through the lens of young adults, young adult leaders, some of whom are in this very room. So I am watching from a distance as a tall ship is being tossed about on an angry ocean. You know, one of those enormous ships with many sails. And at the same time that I'm watching, I am somehow also on that ship. And then the dream abruptly ends, but it has stayed with me for 30 years and has profoundly influenced my life's vocation. The feeling of the dream is, do I stay or do I jump? Do I stay? Do I stay or do I jump? I became a scholar of young adult religious life, largely because of that dream. And now, 30 years later, I want to tell you what I see. Claire, middle, big smile. Claire is a 20-something young white Roman Catholic woman who plays a mean banjo with bright red lipstick on Saturday night folk venues. And on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is being trained and mentoring and approved in following her call to the Roman Catholic priesthood. James, the guy with the tie right in the middle, James grew up in Texas. He's an African-American 20-something who was mentored by white evangelical Christians who noticed his gifts and moved him right along to seminary. And 2/3 of the way through seminary, he was about ready to check out, and he found his way to a national event where the first time in his life he heard of this thing called womanist theology. Theology that was written from the life ways and perspective of his mother and his grandmother and his other mothers. And James says, womanist theology saved my life. He's finishing his PhD in American religious life. He lives just a few blocks away and soon will be teaching American religious history at a seminary or college near you. Tyler is an Asian American 20-something from Minneapolis. Tyler Sitt, United Methodist elder, went out to plant a church with his deep commitments around eco-justice in a neighborhood of Minneapolis that was brown and black. And 2 or 3 months into it, he realized that if his church plant was successful, he would gentrify the neighborhood and displace the people who lived there. So he started from scratch, and he's developing a way of church planting that takes seriously the lives of people of color who are living in neighborhoods that have been economically deprived, and he is holding their voices front and center as he plants a church that is still very much grounded in his vision of eco-justice. Nikki is a woman from New Jersey who has managed to get 16 nonprofit organizations and the church to collaborate in building a tiny house community. She says, imagine a church vacant, overgrown with vegetation, lifeless. Now imagine a church, and off to the side of it, there's this plot of grassy land with 20 tiny houses and a large food garden. This is what churches ought to be doing. Nick is a friend of mine, a 30-something, who's a spoken word artist and also a mental health professional. And he has founded a nonprofit organization that uses the art form of spoken word to give middle schoolers an outlet for their anger, their anxiety, their depression. He calls it life-saving work. And he says, the title and role of pastor, that's way too weighty for me, but there's an aching inside me that yearns to see other young people's lives changed by the very thing that saved my life. I see young artists activated in brave discourses with those around them in pursuit of love, beauty, and togetherness. Jarrell, where's Jarrell? Jarrell's that smiling face up on the hand corner. Jarrell is a 30-something United Methodist ordained elder who is Black and queer and Christian, and blogs about finding God in Chance the Rapper and his struggles to become ordained and to find his calling within the church that he loves. I could go on all night with more of these examples. What I want you to know is that I see multiple diverse communities coming alive because of young leaders like these. They share two things in common: a deep connection to something larger than themselves that will not let them go, and that is resourcing them daily, renourishing them with a sense of inward creativity and resilience and strength beyond the obstacles they face. And the second thing is they are burdened with the heartbeat of their communities. That burden is often a result of their own experiences of trauma, poverty, brokenness, oppression, and it is the result of the necessity of finding a way forward for themselves, finding a way towards healing, and they're just bringing others along. Out of necessity, they are creating spaces that are havens. I call these people justice-seeking, mystic, creative healers, and they call to mind another young adult. They call to mind the ancient life-giving story of a dark-skinned young man who wandered the backwaters of the Holy Roman Empire, sharing life with people who saw the world from the bottom up, from the ground up. These young adults are building Christian community in a post-Christian world, and they're doing so in spite of the ways that many churches harmed them or their people. That dream of mine, that ship with the tall white sails tossing on an angry ocean, well, you probably have guessed I stayed on board. A few weeks later, I was ordained right here in Northern Illinois. Bishop Leontine Kelly, the first African-American female bishop in the United Methodist Church, laid her hands on me and ordained me. To have jumped would have been inauthentic. I was too enamored of that young adult, ancient, life-giving story. But to stay was also problematic, because I lived into the reality more and more each day of the fact that this very ship had carried enslaved people. This very ship, the ship that is white, normative Christianity, had raped and raped still. I carried with me the reality of that. And I am aware today that that church, the white, denominational church as we have known it, is dying. That huge, multifaceted institution which syncretized Christianity with colonizing, empire building, and whiteness is dying. And that probably doesn't come as a surprise to any of us. But let's just pause for a moment to be in that dying, to feel what that feels like. Have any of you ever accompanied someone over the threshold of death? It is hard to do when it's someone we love with whom we've had an easy way, a joyful walk. It is harder still to accompany someone in death when the relationship has been fraught with pain, right? When it's someone we love and it might be someone who's hurt us. It's hard to say goodbye to an institution that we fell in love with Jesus within, but that has also bundled with it some unnecessary pain, some hurt, some ways that we've been malformed, even damaged. But those of us who've done some pastoral care courses or some CPE, some clinical pastoral education, or just been present to our own life experience, know that on the other side of death, if we sit with death, if we hold the space for grief, On the other side of enormous loss, we are able to see new life emerging. Where toxic, patriarchal, white supremacist forms of church are dying, where we are grieving a complicated relationship, new life is emerging. So all around me, I see people in their 20s and 30s who are grounded in contemplative practices, who are activists called to making justice, who drink deeply from their own wells, be that United Methodism or Lutheranism or Catholicism or Pentecostalism, while they are also visiting with good humor the deep wells of their friends and neighbors, be that Judaism or Islam, visiting African spiritualities, learning from other deep wells while not abandoning their own. And they are creating moments that feel like church, far from the walls of church, right? Some of you have been there in those places and said, this is church. Some of you have been at a spoken word event and said, oh, I was in church, right? Some of these young adults are being ordained by their institutions. Many of the ones I've named have been ordained by their institutions, but some of them are being ordained by small little bespoke communities of builders, building tiny houses, or crafters making really good beer, or bakers, or artists, or poets, or dancers. And these gatherings are ordaining them, and by that I mean giving them the authority to be their leaders. As Casper Terkuhle and Angie Thurston are particularly adept at helping us name, young adults from across spiritual traditions are unbundling, taking what is useful from their traditions, but leaving the rest of the wreckage lying on the shore. These young adults are hungry for something. They're hungry for wise sages, and I don't mean sages are old, wise sages who have been steeped in traditions, who can bring them along and explore them and expose them to pockets of the traditions that we hold dear. Like, have you ever known a Calvin geek? Like, there are young people who really want to meet a Calvin geek because there's something about Calvin, the Calvin Institutes, that the world still needs. So we still need those really deep dives into the wealth of tradition because these young people are hungry for the sages who can direct them to the place they need. And they're also hungry for spaces of formation where they can be with others like themselves and say, oh, I'm not crazy. And I've seen them come alive both among groups of Christians, and then when you find Christian innovative leaders, and they're with innovative leaders from across religious faith traditions and from no traditions at all, people who are doing spiritual, forming spiritual communities through CrossFit and Soul Cycle and completely secular places that are yearning for a sense of deeper community, yearning for folks with whom to sit together and ask why. Why am I here? Why does my life matter? Why did my mom die? So these young people are hungry and they are bent towards survival. They're asking, how can I scrabble together a little bit of this and a little bit of that, enough to get by and create something that works? And the result is a fusion. The result I see often is a fusion, a carefully brewed specialty, an entirely new and delightful, perhaps even life-saving combination salvaged from the wreckage. The fusion shows up in a few examples. The simple way is a United Methodist Church in New York, upstate New York. On Thursdays, they get together and they bake artisan, really good bread. And they do it as a spiritual practice, leaning into the monastic tradition, right? And then on Friday, they take it to high-end farmers markets and they sell it for a pretty penny. And the proceeds from their bread pays their pastor's salary, but it also creates food security networks with their neighbors. Our own Gilead community right here represented on the right-hand side of the room, moved into a part of the community where there was a thriving storytelling community and said, we're going to do church around storytelling. I went a few Sundays ago, and it's like being at the Moth Hour, except at the end of every story, we say together, the Word of God for the people of God. And we are affirming that God continues to reveal God's self in this world today, north side of Chicago, Rogers Park, through people who look like us. Not just through the clergy, although there is a sermon, but there is a democratizing of God's revelation and the real embodiment that it happens among all of us. Cincinnati Cathedral, where the Old Testament scholarship of Walter Brueggemann has been just totally embraced. He writes about what does it mean to be a neighbor, and that congregation is exploring what does it mean to be a neighbor in ways that create wealth in communities that have experienced generation after generation of poverty, institutionalized poverty. What does it mean to be neighborly in that place? So they're doing things like creating social impact funds with a portion of their endowment. And they're not just giving that money away, they're creating small business loans, and they're giving it to folks who are formerly caged, formerly incarcerated, who have no avenue for a viable work, and they're letting these folks enjoy the fruits of our labor in what we might imagine as an abundant economy. And they're doing that with a little bit of sacrifice and a lot of love and neighborliness. You scratch the surface of any of these communities, and you don't have to look very far before you find young adults who are either the impetus of these communities or are drawn to these communities because it so naturally befits what they are caring about today. And sometimes in these communities, we see elders accompanying them. And that is where we come in. Those of us who, by virtue of being in this space, are followers of the way of Jesus. We may be conflicted about that. You might ask us what denomination we are. We might have a hard time naming it. But those of us who know that tall ship, either as insiders or outsiders, have seen it foundering on the sea, have seen the numbers go down in some communities, stay the same in others, but they know that this is where we come in. We can nourish the resurrection. The project that we are leading together here in Chicago began, if you recall, a few of you are in the room, by training 10 young people to listen, to create a particular kind of listening space for their peers, other young adults. And we invited all of you to do the same thing with young adults in your orbits. As we look forward today and tomorrow and over the next several weeks, we envision new forms of congregational life growing out of this process of deep, holy listening that cultivates empathy toward young adults. So holy listening, that encounter that you just had, it listens without an agenda. It listens without interrupting. It listens while imagining that the person in front of you is a potential vessel of the holy. And as you may have experienced, either in the 2 little minutes you had or in your longer dive in listening with a young adult in or around your congregation, when we do this holy listening, oftentimes something mysterious happens. A way opens. Something magical transpires. The young adult interviewers who were part of our first cohort, they learned that their peers are desperately wanting to be heard. They learned that their peers want to be engaged by people who are part of institutions, maybe not by the institutions themselves, but they want to be engaged. They want lives of meaning and purpose, and they want to tell a better story about the future waiting to be born through them. While they most often do not want to call themselves Christian, across the board in these interviews, it was really hard, as You may know, because you were doing those interviews, even though they're acting like Christians, they don't want to use that label. And they are often so in love, though, with the practices that mark Christian community. So as you design your projects based on what you learned from your own holy listening, as Bethany leads us through this process of innovation and design thinking to create perhaps something that's never been seen before, I hope that you will hold close the experience of holy listening. I hope that you'll continue some form of intentional practice that brings you again and again into that mysterious space of holy listening with young people in your midst. Become a holy listening congregation. It's really easy. You find a young adult and you listen to them. If it helps to say that you're part of a research project that is interviewing young adults, then create a research project that is interviewing young adults. While you listen, keep your agenda at home. Keep it out of the way. You know it's there, but just put it aside. Put aside your fears that the church is dying. Put aside your fears that your pension plan might not be what you thought it was when you signed up for this work. And listen as if what they have to say is all that matters in the world for these moments. Ask them, what do you love? What do you care about? What keeps you awake at night? And you'll gain access, maybe not to answers, maybe to some answers, but probably more questions and doubts and holy yearnings that are being held by your barista or the person next to you in the DMV line, or maybe your coworkers. If you're my age, your adult children, your adult children's friends, your adult children's exes. True story. And you'll come away realizing that they may be looking for allies, and they may recognize among us holy listeners who do not have all the answers, because that's not what they're looking for, but who are together seeking to live into a better future that will mourn if we do not step into our roles. We may discover, if we engage in holy listening continually, perpetually, over and over again, that there in the listening we find what we are called to do. What we are called to do together. So that dream ended with a deep knowing. I would find a piece of wreckage and I would cling to it like that scene in the Titanic, but that would not be the end. I would wash up on shore with a bunch of other broken and washed up pieces exactly where we need to be. There is something altogether holy about nourishing the resurrection through nourishing the vocations of hybrid young leaders and leaders to be, leaders who haven't even discovered their leaders, who are gifted with a confident connection to something larger than themselves, or a questing wondering about where is that something larger than myself that I think I know I feel, and who are burdened by the heartbeats of their communities. They're often already doing the work of racial reparation. They're often already doing the work of radical hospitality, especially around gender and orientation. And they are doing the work of resurrection. Resurrection, like Sankofa, fetches what is useful from the nutrient-rich past and finds ways to bring it forward to meet the needs, the deep longings of today. I am so glad to be on this ship. I'm glad I stayed. I'm glad to be in this moment in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ. I'm glad to be with you all. I'm glad to have these comrades, these friends, as we sit together through the difficult work of letting go of what is dying. Blessing the death, mourning, and being present with you all to help nourish the resurrection in new forms of Christianity that, may we hope, closely resemble its very origins. Thank you for journeying with me on this little thought exploration. And I ask you now to turn to one other person. It can be your person in the room. And just share one thing you're holding. It could be an aha, it could be a question. It could be a thorn that I planted that doesn't feel quite right. And share that for a minute, and then I think Bethany is going to help me kind of debrief and host a conversation around what this might be stimulating in you as you look forward to the next day and a half, couple of weeks, and the rest of our project. Okay? So in case y'all haven't met Bethany yet, this is Bethany Stolle, and she's joining us from her home in Seattle to be our resident expert on design thinking and practical theology. And in case some of y'all haven't met me before, I'm Dori Baker, the research director on this project. I see a few new faces in the room, So we're going to converse with you as you share kind of popcorn fashion what's lingering for you, what questions, what thorns, what ahas. Where'd it land? Where are you?
Where I'm sitting right now is, what does church death look like? And in order for a resurrection to happen, there has to be like a complete death the way that I understand it. Mm-hmm. So what does that look like? Mm-hmm.
I'm having the same how. That's the only really thing I could think of. How. I think we know, at least for me, we know like, we have a good idea. We don't know anything. Why? And we also know like what. We just don't know how.
So I want to directly respond to the question, does the church have to die completely, with an example that's in the room, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rebecca, but I see, I don't think the whole thing has to die. I think portions of it will die. I think the toxic portions of it need to die, right? But I see the way that Rebecca shared with me a few weeks ago, the way that Gilead is structured, the way that it can be this new thing that happens on Sunday evening is because every Sunday morning, Rebecca and Vince pastor a UCC church that's still connected to all the institutional stuff of the UCC church. And in a way, the UCC church's resources are being composted like good fertilizer to give birth to this new thing. So in that situation, I would say, the forms of Sunday morning church in some places may be dying. And in this in-between time, while we're sitting at the bedside wondering what kind of time, what kind of life do we have left together? What's the quality of our life together? We can also be composting some of those resources. And that's the way my mind plays with what you and Vince have done in terms of, I'm still ordained, I'm still with this institution, and at the same time, I'm forming something that doesn't look UCC at all. Still has ritual, you still have communion. Yep.
I kind of think of, like back when I was a kid in elementary school, we were like high off energy when they brought the TV and the wheels out. But nowadays, we have smart boards in classrooms, and when the kid gets to go over and touch that, they're excited. And so I think when it comes to church, just like that, as the kids grow up, things have changed. There's a different way of doing certain things that you can't use for a different group of people. So, like you just said, some things have to die. It's just got to go in order for it to progress into something better. I feel like the church is still running on the Amtrak while the world is in a fighter jet, millions of miles away. So, yeah.
That sounded like a technology issue. I wonder if you have anything from the design world.
Well, I think it's interesting also thinking about like the expectations that are shifting, and how do we also listen to the experiences across the breadth of the church, because we also don't want to just say, oh, this older stuff is dead, because we have a lot of wisdom and opportunity to learn. So how can we build more connections too, so that like, because who's to say that, you know, someone else who was excited about the cart being wheeled on isn't also going to be excited about the smartboard. So how can we find more opportunities to build bridges too, instead of just writing off one way of experiencing church altogether?
I guess one thing that you said, or one kind of thorn, I guess, if you will, was when you mentioned young adults or certain people may be 100% bought in on everything that we're talking about, but it's the word Christian that really digs at them, and I experienced that a lot with my people I interviewed, and so I just wanted to understand why, and clearly you must have had some sort of a negative experience with that word, and there were some different answers, but a lot of times it was more based off judgmental, feeling like you should fit into a certain way, which I get, but the thing that is just still tough for me to understand, that's been someone that's not really involved with faith, is just how come there's so many different denominations, and how some people here are Methodist or Lutheran, I can't even name them all. I mean, it's almost like, how can you say you're not judgmental when there's still all these different denominations? What's the difference? And I just, in my head, it's like there must be some little web that spun off. No, this person did that, and I'm going to believe that. And that's what's been, and so that's my sticking point. So when I think about certain things have to go, or my wild visions, I wonder 100 years from now, what denominations are going to look like.
I think that's because, the church is supposed to be this sacred place for people. And so when you're pushed around and beat around somewhere, you're going to go somewhere else. You're going to sit there and take it. And so you're going to go to the next place. And if that doesn't work for you, you're going to go to the next place. And so I think that's where the denominations started falling in. Well, we don't mix well with this, so let's start our own thing. And they didn't feel like that, so we're going to start our own thing. And so people get comfortable, they put themselves in their own situation that's comfortable for them. And I feel like we've gotten to a point where we're all not comfortable now. So now what do we do? So now we're all sitting here in a room together trying to figure out, okay, we got all these denominations, now what?
Well, and I want to build on what you were saying too, because often it happens, the fracturing happens because it's I'm not that. And I think the opportunity that we have here, we're participating in a creative act. We're trying to bring something new and kind of raise new life and participate in the resurrection. And so how can we say this is what we're for? And I think what we'll be going into the rest of this weekend too is critique, which can be, it sounds negative, and parts of it are, and parts of it are going to be painful because other people are giving you feedback on ideas that you may not want to hear. But how can you use that to sharpen your perspective on this is who we are, this is what we're about, and here's how we see a vision of what the church can be like moving forward, as opposed to, I'm not that. So you're defining who you are and who you want to be, as opposed to who you aren't.
I think, like you said, how a lot of times people say the church isn't just the church, or is it the church is?
Yeah.
Because you can't put us all in one category if we're all different things. And that causes confusions to some people when you say Christians, and we all work a different certain way. And I think that's for young people like me. I'm like, well, I go to this church, and they're running around sweating, and I go to a Catholic high school, and we're doing mass, and we're done in 30 minutes. So you're like, what's going on? We don't call ourselves Christians.
This side of the room, yay. Remind me your name.
Mary Beth.
Hi, Mary Beth.
One thing that stuck out to me was just the way that, like, for me and my own faith journey, I'm like, in that the midst of the deconstruction of my faith. And I think, it's a very uneasy place because I think a lot of times, like, the church tells people, like, you should be on fire all the time, and once you're on this trajectory, you just keep growing and growing and growing, and it's all, rosy and beautiful. And you're just, like, experiencing freedom after freedom. And it's like, okay, well, I'm in a place where it's, like, really hard, and I'm like, I don't know. Well, I left the law stuff. Like, I don't know what I believe, and whatever. And I can see the way that, like, my friends are in similar places, and so I think when they kind of hit the place where it's like, I don't know, where you're kind of out of your depth a little bit, it just now it's like, well, I guess I'm not a Christian. But, I mean, I'm thankful for the way of the Lord. I just keep showing up. That's really mostly what it is. I just keep showing up. I don't it's not like there's this like amazing things like happening in my heart or whatever. But I think like, I don't know, sorry, I'm gonna keep speaking and hopefully it'll come back to it. But like ending up on like the shore, when you're saying that, because we should be. I don't know, I think I'm still not this was like, it can feel a little like isolated. And I know that there's like other people that are living in the same place, And so I just, I don't know, I think for me going forward, and hopefully for a lot of people in my generation, that we allow ourselves to go through the mess. Like the last time we got together, this is it. Came back to it. The last time we got together, we put up this is how different generations are. Like I'm in the generation that asks why, but I'm being churched by people that say this is what it is, And so as I'm going through why and I'm deconstructing all of it, it's really uneasy because other generations they don't really do that. And so I think like letting go of some of like the shame, maybe why I asked her, the judgment, maybe why I asked her. And just knowing like, okay, this is kind of how I'm built, regardless of whether this is my generation or not, that's just how I'm built. And hopefully going forward, I can be a voice to other people.
Absolutely. The response that keeps resounding in me as I hear you talk is, I'm so glad you're being a voice and speaking out loud the very doubt that you have as a Christian leader, because every single one of those faces up there would say amen to what you've just said. And truth be told, most of the saints throughout history, when you dig down deep into what they wrote, even sometimes you don't have to go that deep, it's rife with doubt. And there is the pattern of just showing up because God will show up. And it's sometimes, you don't even have to go the whole 360, sometimes you just have to turn the other way, right? And you realize, oh, it's this close, even though you feel so far away. There is this grand mystery of the journey of doubt and faith and grace and hope, and there's still buoyancy. There's still a lot of buoyancy for that ship, That's still floating. Other thorns, complexities, stuff that has to be said before you can go on and do the work of innovating and designing. Anything that's like burning in you?
I think I'll say for me, I know you all picked up on like that people young adults don't necessarily want to be labeled Christian. One thing that I noticed is young adults don't like the word church. Even for me, as a 24-year-old, when I'm telling my friends, like, oh, I'm going to go to church. I'm going to church, or me and so-and-so, we go to church. It's like an automatic, like, oh, y'all going to church or whatever. Or when I invite people, like we have this nice text message that we'll send folks, right? to invite them. Sometimes I gotta edit it just because like I know like they may not want to come because of a certain word.
One word might be the...
Yeah. So it's hard for me to think about. I have like the girl in my interview. She said, "I don't feel like you have to go to church to be a Christian." A lot of young adults say that. And a revelation that I had when I kind of walked out of skepticism was, we are the church no matter where we are. So yeah, right? You don't have to go because it's not a four-wall thing. So how do we deconstruct the idea of the church being four-wall? So we need to stop calling it that. We have to call it something else. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a real truth. I do not believe this project is about shoring up the institutional church. I believe this project is about aligning our imagination and our creativity with the will of God, which may or may not align with where the institution chooses to follow. Can I get an amen on that? Amen. Okay. All right, we're at time. You guys, I'm sorry, let's take one last question from Deanna, and then we'll take a break.
I was just going to comment on, I feel like there's some patterns here with what people have been talking about, and they're beautiful ones, right? So we're talking about tension within the church and disagreement, but we're also talking about deconstruction and reconstruction, maybe not necessarily like resurrection, but more redemption. And if we're looking at the history of the church since before it was called the church, like if we're looking at God's history in the world, that's his pattern, is that he makes something, we screw it up, and then he deconstructs it, he deconstructs it, and reconstructs it, right? And like we all have to do that individually. And I'm right there with you, by the way. But also as a church, like, why do we think we get to escape from that? We get to do it too, and we're going to do it again and again. It gets better every time.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, we will break, and we have 10 minutes, and we're going to regather in room 205 and embark on the next step of our journey together. Thank you all.